I am super excited about tonight's program and frankly, this series. I think it was, well, I've been a rabbi 16 years now, so it's probably been 18 or 19 years since I took this class, Real Theology, at Hebrew Union College. And it was taught by really two of the best is, of course, a subjective term, but two absolutely wonderful professors, one of whom many of you have likely heard of, Rabbi Dr. Eugene Borowitz, who is known or was known, he died a few years ago in his upper 90s, as the premier Reform theologian. And he really helped to codify and create a theology for Reform Judaism in particular. And he partnered in this class with Dr. Wendy Zierler, who was a newer professor, had a literature background in addition to being incredibly Jewishly literate and brilliant. And it was quite the class. And if I remember correctly, again, because it was a long time ago, we had 6 or 7 movies that we would tackle in the class that they taught from. And then for our project, each of us took a movie and did a presentation similar as I'm doing tonight. The movie that I actually did the presentation on was not Shawshank Redemption, but the movie that we're doing next month, which I will share at the end of the program. So stay in suspense. So tonight, we're going to talk about the Shawshank Redemption, one of my absolute favorite movies. I'm guessing many of you have seen it. Here are just some facts about the movie. It was put out in 1994. Another movie that is based on the work of Stephen King. Not everyone knows that, especially because it is not his typical horror style. It actually comes from the same book called Different Seasons that the story Stand By Me came from. And in that book, Stephen King had 4 stories, one corresponding to each season of the year. Anyway, it was nominated for 7 Oscars. You can see them there. Nominated for 2 Golden Globes. I had this whole animation thing. Here we go. Watch this, everyone. Watch this. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate you acting your enthusiasm for that. So nominated for 7 Oscars, as I said, 2 Golden Globes, and incredibly well-loved in popular culture. At one point, not too long ago, it was the #1 movie on IMDb. Now it's number 60, which sounds like it's not great, but the way IMDb works now is movies that have just come out tend to be more popular, and then they fall way down. As a trivia question, and I can't see the chat because I'm sharing the screen, but how many of those Oscars did Shawshank Redemption win? It was not, whoops, it was,
What did it say?
See what happens, see what happens. It was nominated for 7. How many did it win? Someone unmute themselves and take a guess.
7.
Did not 7.
It should have.
Totally agree, Marcy. It won 0.
Oh.
Because it had the unfortunate time to go against Forrest Gump. It was actually a big year. Forrest Gump, Quiz Show, and Shawshank Redemption, and Pulp Fiction. And there was another one that I'm forgetting, but those were the ones nominated. Of course, Forrest Gump won and took a ton of other things with it. Okay, so let's talk about the movie. There we go. The main characters. We have, of course, Andy Dufresne, who never ages. Do you notice that he does the aging in this movie was not done phenomenally. Ellis Boyd Redding, the warden, Warden Norton, and Captain Hadley. As an aside, I don't know if any of you are watching the reboot of Dexter that's on Showtime, but this gentleman is one of the main actors in the season. And of course, it's over 25 years later. So he's much older. And Emily and I are watching, and I'm like, I know him from somewhere. I know him from somewhere. And finally, I looked it up. I mean, I've seen Shawshank Redemption probably 10, 15 times. And so when I realized he was Captain Hadley, it was a moment. And I would actually argue, and this isn't, what we're doing tonight is not the place for this conversation. It's, more of a kind of a film studies. But the main character, the protagonist of this movie, is not Andy Dufresne. It's Red. It's the character played by Morgan Freeman, because he is the one who changes. Andy Dufresne is the same person throughout the movie. He doesn't have any, I mean, certainly experiences happen to him that are of great import, but as a person, he leaves in many ways the same person he came in as, whereas the Red character completely changes. Okay. So let's get into the themes of the movie and how they might relate to Judaism. So when Red is narrating, which he does oh so well, like only Morgan Freeman can, he has this line that prison consists of routine and then more routine. And people need hobbies. And so, Andy, at first, he has the polishing of the rocks, and then the chessboard, and then, of course, the library, but things to take up people's time. And in Judaism, we have this word, minhag, which many of you know. A minhag is a custom. It's a routine of sorts. Every Friday night, we have services. That's a minhag. The Talmud refers to what is known as minhag hamakom, the customs of the place. So, you go to a new synagogue and maybe they have a different tune or they do something differently and you ask about it. It's like, that's the way we do it here. That's a minhag hamakom. The challenge, even in Judaism, is that we can get so ossified, so stuck in our minhagim, that in some ways, and I'm of course using this word purposefully for tonight's discussion, we become prisoners to them. That we are so used to doing something that we don't know anything else. And if that thing is now taken away from us, we in some ways don't know how to function. And so, sometimes people feel like this after a relationship ends, whether it's, a divorce or a bad breakup or a death. Sometimes after many years of marriage, people feel like this sometimes after changing jobs or moving, that we get so used to our minhagim that we forget that not only things can change, but they should and do change. And as a little Hebrew play, and I should have put the two words in Hebrew. When I do this, 10 years from now and no one remembers, I'll have the words in Hebrew. You see the word below minhag is Gehenna. Again, not the time for the conversation, but Gehenna is the Jewish concept of hell for all intents and purposes. For our discussion tonight, it's not good. Just think of it as not good. The reason I use it tonight is because if you look at the Hebrew word minhag and you read it backwards, namely left to right, it spells Gehenna. And so it kind of tells this story that if we are so stuck in our routine, we are actually doing something really bad. And then the other Hebrew word is one I'm guessing many of you know, Mitzrayim. So we talk about Mitzrayim all the time. Last night at Shabbat services, I probably said the word 3 times because it's just in our liturgy. Now, Mitzrayim, of course, is Egypt. And I've taught this before, so many of you may remember this, but Mitzrayim is actually a conjunction or a compound word made up of 3 words. Mi, tsar, and im. if any of you study or have studied Hebrew and remember it, a mi is a prefix meaning from. So that's the first word. The last im is a plural ending. So it's from some things. Okay, so what is it? Tsar. A tsar is a narrow place. From the narrow places. And so I'm using this to start tonight because for me, the movie, so much of the movie's power lies in this idea that the prison walls at first are horrible. You hate them. And we'll see the quote in a little bit, but then you grow to depend on them. And what is it in our lives? And this, of course, is a theme in Passover when we talk about exiting the narrow places. What is it in our lives that are narrow that we're stuck in? And Judaism plays with this because both slavery and freedom in Judaism can, of course, be physical, but they are also spiritual. And so that leads us to the question, is freedom external or internal? So I don't think it's an accident that in the script, when the warden gives Andy the Bible, he says, salvation lies within. Now, he didn't mean for Andy to hide a rock hammer into it, but that regardless of circumstance. And if any of you have ever read, I know I sometimes talk about the 10 Jewish books you should read before you die. I think last Adult Ed, I mentioned As a Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg. Another one is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which I wouldn't necessarily say is a Jewish book. It just happens to be written by a Jewish man who survived the Holocaust. And what he talks about is that we can find meaning and joy in our lives with the sole requirement that we are alive and our brain is and we have consciousness. It doesn't mean we don't have pain. It doesn't mean we don't have tragedy, but we can still have meaning and joy. That is up to us. It lies within us. It is not external. And then, of course, the quote that I mentioned, and we're going to talk about Brooks Hadlin, the librarian, toward the end. But when Brooks kind of goes crazy and puts the knife to Haywood because he hears that he's gotten his parole and he doesn't want to leave the prison, Red says, these prison walls are funny. First, you hate them. Then you get used to them. Then you depend on them. So powerful. And then one of my favorite parts, and it's meant to be a climax scene, when Andy locks the guard in the bathroom and plays the opera song for the entire prison. And again, the narration says, every last man at Shawshank felt free, which again shows, or I think is a reminder, that prison and internment do not dictate where we are emotionally or spiritually. All right, and then I want to talk about that part a little more. But first, I forgot I moved the slides around for a different reason. So I want to talk about this idea of wanting to be in the prison versus being free. And I think it relates perfectly to us leaving Egypt in the Bible. So in Numbers, and if we were in person, I'd have other people reading and such. So I apologize for my monotonous voice. And when we're done, by the way, we will absolutely have conversation. All the Israelites railed against Moses and Aaron. And they said, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. And the whole community shouted at them, or if only we might die in this wilderness. Why is God taking us to that land to fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be carried off. Basically, they are whining. They're complaining. They don't like their freedom. And what do they say? It would be better for us to go back to Egypt. And they said to one another, let us go back to Egypt. And that very similar thought when Brooks Hadlin gets parole and is kind of going through his new routine and not liking it. He kind of fantasizes about going back home, namely Shawshank. And he says, I love this part, maybe I should get me a gun and rob the foodway so they'd send me home. I could shoot the manager while I was at it, sort of like a bonus. This idea of, we think freedom is this ultimate gift of redemption, of joy, like that's what we want, but then we get it, or others get it, or the Egyptians get it, and we don't want it. And without going into a huge lecture that we don't have time for, Judaism even teaches that freedom is not the goal. So, if we were to map Shawshank Redemption onto Judaism, freedom isn't really the end. What the end is holiness. And for us, that comes in Torah. That's why I think I don't know if it was purposeful, but certainly important to me as a Jew, at least, that when Steven Spielberg made the Prince of Egypt movie, it doesn't end with the climactic scene of the splitting of the Red Sea. It ends with Mount Sinai and giving Torah, because freedom is only important in as much as we take responsibility. It's not like, what kids think, well, I could do anything I want. And some, by the way, doing anything you want, it doesn't feel free, as I think we know and we've seen. So I think that's an interesting tension that the movie certainly plays with, but Judaism absolutely. Okay. The world is a narrow bridge between fear and hope. Many of you know this very famous line from Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar ma'od v'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. The whole world is a narrow bridge. The most important thing is not to be afraid. And I picked that because fear comes up a lot in the movie, but it only comes up when Brooks first and then Red are free. It doesn't happen when they're at Shawshank and comfortable to a degree. It's when they're alone in their bed at night and having nightmares and not knowing where they are and all those things. And that's why, tragically, Brooks takes his life, because of that fear. And Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav says, it's not just prison. It's not just people who would do us harm. And of course, I'm paraphrasing here, but our whole lives are like this. All of our experiences are a narrow bridge. On the one side is fear, and on the other side is hope. And again, it is up to us, which of course is a very Jewish sentiment. Okay, so now we're coming back to what Andy says after he comes back from 1 week in the hole, as they call it, the inside lingo of solitary confinement, following him playing the song for all of the guards. He says to one of his buddies, it's the easiest time I've ever done. And he says, oh, wow, they let you take that record player with you, huh? And he says, no, the music was in here. And then he says this quote, that's the beauty of music. They can't get that from you. You need it in here so you don't forget. Forget that there are places in the world that aren't made out of stone, that there's something inside that they can't get to. They can't touch. It's yours. Hope. And then Red says, hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can drive a man insane. It has no use on the inside, meaning in jail. And then I didn't put it here, but then Andy says something like, that's the lesson. Yeah, Brooks would have agreed with you. In other words, Brooks Hadlin didn't have hope. And so there's this, again, interesting, powerful, and in some ways very sad tension of, is it okay, or should we hope for a better life, a better circumstance, if it seems unlikely, even when it seems unlikely? And I say, absolutely. And quite frankly, we do it all the time. We pray for someone's health even when they might be in the last stages of life. We pray for the peace of Israel. And I think very practically and unfortunately speaking, that is likely not to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean that those aren't our ideals and our hopes. So I want to talk about a Jewish response to Red. Like, what would Judaism say to Red, who's obviously intelligent? I mean, certainly street smart, but there is something, I think, to what he's saying, that, hope is a dangerous thing. I feel that. And so, again, not the Jewish response, but a Jewish response, I think, is again just before the Exodus, is Nachshon. So I've told this story before. When the Israelites were escaping Egypt, as Pharaoh finally let them go following the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh again changes his mind. And so the Israelites are rushing to freedom. The Egyptians are fast behind them. And all of a sudden, the Israelites are stuck, because in front of them is this expanse of the Red Sea, and behind them are the Egyptians coming fast to overtake them and probably kill them. And so rather than pray and wait for a miracle, Nachshon begins wading into the waters of the Red Sea, singing Mi Chamocha, even though nothing has happened yet. And as he is singing, the waters split. So what I think Judaism would say to Red, and what I'd like to think is in my best self, is the kind of outlook I have, although certainly not always, is that blind hope perhaps is dangerous, but hope followed by some sort of action. And by the way, even if that action is prayer, especially if that prayer is in community, which we're going to get to, then it is not only not dangerous, but beneficial, helpful, and even holy. So let's talk about hope. Not surprising that lots of things are from Passover for this one. So on Passover, we say, and some of it is in the Torah, this is the bread of destitution or of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Anyone who is hungry should come and eat. Anyone in need should come and partake of the Pesach. Now we are here. Next year, we will be in the land of Israel. This year, we are slaves. Next year, we will be free people. If this isn't an expression of hope, I don't know what is. Because remember, the Israelites, when they celebrate the first Passover, they are still slaves. The Exodus has not happened. The miracle of the Red Sea has not happened. And certainly they have not gotten Torah yet. And so even in our darkest times, we have hope. And in traditional Judaism, this is true for the Messiah. One of the standard prayers for the coming of the Messiah is, even though he tarries, meaning even though he hasn't come yet, and life is hard, and I am suffering, even though all of those things are true, I still pray with faith for the coming of the Messiah. And then, of course, some of us were in Israel a year and a half ago. We all know the national anthem of Israel is called Hatikva, literally meaning the hope. If you think about it as a thought experiment, it could have been called anything. A national anthem can reflect any value. It could have reflected faith. It could have reflected God's steadfast love or mercy, or the Exodus. It could have reflected anything, but it is the hope. And of course, the hope specifically, the hope that is 2,000 years old, I alluded to this already, to be a free nation in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. So there is a very interesting contrast between Brooks, who's pictured on the right, and Red, who's of course on the left, because both of them are freed, And in some ways, what happens to them mirrors each other. It seems they're at the same halfway house to live. They work probably at the same food mart. But what happens is vastly different. So let's ask the question. Both of them, in Red's words, were institutionalized. They were both imprisoned for more than 30 years and had grown used to those walls, so to speak. So why does Red have hope and Brooks doesn't? I think this is why. So this is the quote of the movie for me. I saw the movie for the first time. I remember exactly, I don't remember like physically where I was, but I was a sophomore in college at the University of Florida. And I heard this line, get busy living or get busy dying, and it just hit me. And I didn't make this comparison at the time, of course, but as I was planning this session, this section from Deuteronomy chapter 30 came to mind. This passage is read on Yom Kippur. It's one of the few passages that's read twice a year, one in its when it's allocated in the weekly Torah portion, and then again in Yom Kippur. I'll read it very briefly. You can see it in front of you. This is when Moses is basically giving his farewell speech to the Israelites as they are about to go to Israel. I have set this day before you life and prosperity, death and adversity. I command you this day to love God, walk in God's ways, and to keep God's commandments, God's laws and God's rules, that you may thrive and increase, and that God may bless you in the land that you are about to enter and possess. But if your heart turns away and you give no heed and are lured into the worship and service of other gods, I declare to you this day that you shall certainly perish. You shall not long endure on the soil that you are crossing, the Jordan, in order to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. God could have said, get busy living or get busy dying. If you and your offspring would live by loving God, heeding God's commandments, and holding fast to God. For thereby you shall have life and shall long endure upon the soil that God swore to your ancestors. So without Torah, just take Torah away for a second. I think what Andy's saying here is at any point in our life, we can choose to move forward, to kind of stagnate, or God forbid, to move backwards. Any point in our life. And we should get busy living. And think about the high holidays. I mean, they weren't that long ago. That this is in many ways, I think, what the high holidays are all about, is appreciating the sacredness and holiness of time so that we, quote unquote, get busy living. My last point before we open it up to discussion and any questions is I asked this question, what did Red have that Brooks didn't? And the answer, in my mind, is Andy. Andy was looking out for him and had that, the little tin can of money and things waiting for him. But even without that, he made Andy a promise. And he even says that there's one thing that stops me from going the route Brooks did. And that's my promise to my friend. And it just highlights so beautifully the importance of relationships and community. And, I don't think we overstate that in Judaism. And I certainly don't think we overstate that at CCI, but it bears reminding how important that is, even when we're over Zoom and even when we're not necessarily in physical proximity. Knowing that we are here for one another keeps us going to a degree. I mean, nothing, God forbid, is tragic like Brooks taking his own life. God forbid. But loneliness, sadness, lack of meaning, lack of purpose. That's what happens when we don't have people who care for us and for us to care for them. And the friendship between those two men is just so powerful. And at the end of the movie, I think it's perfect that it ends the way it does without you don't hear either of them say anything to one another. You just see that beautiful blue ocean and them embrace, and then the camera pulls out. But that's my Jewish take on the Shawshank Redemption, talking about hope and freedom and imprisonment. And